Welcome, and thank you for taking the time to be with us today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jeff Kubiak. I'm a professor of practice at ASU, where I serve as the director of future security education in ASU's Future Security Initiative. The educational offerings I help guide include the MA in Global Security, the MAGS, which has a non-technical concentration in cybersecurity and a soon-to-launch concentration in irregular warfare. We also offer a graduate certificate in global security and competitive statecraft and are building a new portfolio of short courses in similar topics to be offered in ASU's career and professional development educational outlet called Career Catalyst. Today's event is one in a series of events that we run each fall and spring semesters to highlight the thought-leading security practitioner faculty that teach in our programs. Today's presenter is Professor Jonathan Kinkle. Professor Kinkle has been teaching in the MAGS almost since its inception. He has taught a whole range of courses, but routinely teaches our courses in Understanding Conflict and War and the Global Politics of Security. In addition to being an assistant teaching professor in the Future Security Initiative in the School of Politics and Global Studies, Jonathan is a non-resident associate at the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard University. He has a background in political science with a PhD from the University of Texas at Austin and law with the JD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And his research is focused on the intersection between comparative politics, international relations, Chinese politics, and global institutions. He has recently published a book entitled Growth and Survival, an ecological analysis of court reform in urban China. The discussion today is titled The New Volatility in the US-China-Russia Triangle. Professor Kinkle will start with a 20 or 30-minute discussion about the changes in this triangular distribution of power and their importance for understanding contemporary global security events. Then we'll open it up for questions. Please feel free at any time to submit your questions to the Q&A block, and I'll try to get them answered at the appropriate time. Professor Kinkle, thank you for coming today. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Jeff, and I'll start sharing my slides here. Yeah, and as you can see here, the title of my talk is The New Volatility in the US-China-Russia Triangle, which is not to suggest that volatility itself is new in these relationships, but rather that the US and China in particular seem to be on a new trajectory that departs from a previous path that had been set since the early 1970s with the Nixon-Mao visit that was famously brokered by Henry Kissinger. And this new trajectory in the past decade or so is conditioned in large part by dynamics that can be traced back to the Soviet era. So I'll begin this talk with a brief history of the origins of the US-China-Soviet triangle, which should provide a good background for understanding the current US-China-Russia triangle. And after that, I'll discuss some recent research on different aspects of the triangle, which has started featuring two concepts related to China's foreign policy: economic insecurity and the confidence of declinism, that seem to be setting the parameters for the contemporary triangle and great power competition, and seem to be reflected in events such as China's zero COVID policies, recent economic retrenchment in China since 2008, and even China's response to Russia's war in Ukraine over the past 2 years. So first, what is the US-China-Russia triangle? First, it's somewhat unconventional to phrase it this way, especially from a realist perspective, where what is usually debated are the security repercussions of unipolar, bipolar, or multipolar distributions of power. But it is common for those who might focus more on the US-China relationship or area studies scholars to emphasize the triangular relationship between the US, China, and Russia as central to forming the modern global order, in which it is assumed that the bipolar Cold War rivalry between the US and Soviet Union was balanced mainly, or at least heavily, by the People's Republic of China. So on this first part of the talk will be a bit about the historical background of the triangle. So it might seem natural in the aftermath of World War II, as the communists took power on mainland China in 1949, for the two largest communist states to align with each other. And this is, of course, exactly what happened in the early 1950s anyway. And you'll see here on this slide, right here, on the left, a photo of Mao and Stalin together, reflecting that in these years, Chinese leader Mao Zedong spent extensive time and resources cultivating a personal relationship with Soviet leader Joseph Stalin because of China's strong desire to industrialize, especially for military purposes. And Stalin obliged, sending Soviet experts and equipment to Beijing enabling China to develop a wide variety of civilian and military industrial products, ultimately including, of course, nuclear weapons. This was a period of close Sino-Soviet partnership, including, of course, in the Korean War. But when Stalin died in 1953, a power struggle ensued in the USSR, and Nikita Khrushchev's rise to power began a series of events that eventually led to a major security threat to China posed by the Soviet Union. So Khrushchev and Mao are pictured here on the right in happier times, but in February 1956, Khrushchev announced the de-Stalinization of Soviet policy. And following this pronouncement from Moscow, protests broke out in communist states, including Hungary, demanding social and economic reforms. Now, the Soviet response to the Hungarian Revolution would ultimately help unravel the Sino-Soviet partnership. In October and November of 1956, the Soviet Union crushed the Hungarian reform movement. And later, under Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev in 1968, the Soviet Union similarly led Warsaw Pact troops in an invasion of Czechoslovakia to crack down on reformist trends emerging there, which in this Cold War era map, you can see the central location in the Eastern Bloc of both of those countries. Now, although the Soviet Union's actions successfully halted the pace of reform in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, they led to a dramatic reorientation of the US-China-Soviet triangle, because Soviet leadership justified the use of force in Prague under what would become known as the Brezhnev Doctrine, which stated that Moscow had the right to intervene in any country where a communist government had been threatened. This doctrine seemingly established to retroactively justify Soviet action in Czechoslovakia also sent a message to communist China. Beijing feared that the Soviet Union would use the doctrine as a justification to then invade or interfere with Chinese communism, leading to what is now known as the Sino-Soviet split. So while it might have been correct to assume that the world's two largest communist powers would have been natural allies, in the early 1950s, a violent conflict erupted between the nuclear-armed communist powers, leading to a major reconfiguration of the triangle. Following the Soviet crackdown in Prague and the issuance of the Brezhnev Doctrine, Sino-Soviet tensions erupted in two serious border incidents. First in March 1969 over Zhenbao Island in the Ussuri River, which is on this map, over on the eastern side, somewhat close to the border with North Korea, resulting in heavy casualties. China responded with a massive military buildup to prepare for war with the Soviet Union. Soviet forces marched in the Xinjiang region of China in August 1969. And you note that Xinjiang is about 3,000 miles to the west here on the map. And although China and the Soviet Union eventually stepped back from the brink of all-out war, the ensuing talks did nothing to alleviate Chinese hostility to the Soviet Union at this time. So in this way, the dynamics of the triangle set the stage for the formation of the modern global order, as China, believing its security was threatened by the Soviet Union, then reached out to an unlikely partner, that being the United States. So according to foreign policy historian Warren Cohen, many Americans at this time saw closer ties with Beijing as a product of disaffection with the war in Vietnam. And so slowly, Nixon signaled a desire to improve relations with China. Kissinger visited Beijing in 1971 to prepare for Nixon's 1972 visit, which is in this famous picture on the left in this slide. Given that the PRC successfully maneuvered to replace Taiwan as China's representative to the UN and the Security Council ahead of Nixon's visit, Mao was in a very strong position going into the meeting and with Nixon and the Americans, which would prove to be an historic moment that precipitated a long reconfiguration of the triangle, setting into motion a range of developments that included the US recognizing and establishing full and official diplomatic relations with the PRC during the Carter administration. And then later, China's renewed application, of course, for membership to the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in 1986 and its subsequent accession to the WTO in 2001. So as a result of the Sino-Soviet split, China became deeply integrated into a global capitalist economy, largely led by the United States. But what's more, as I start now to go into some more contemporary developments in the triangle, is that the export-led model of economic growth that this led to in China also became a major pillar of China's domestic political legitimacy over the next several decades. The way that this happened on a macro scale is that China's opening to the international economy also became closely tied, starting in the 1990s, to the source of its domestic legitimacy. And the assumption here in the scholarship in political economy in China is that this type of legitimacy, called performance legitimacy, has since probably the 1990s become an explanation for China's regime stability. And it is a concept that assumes that authoritarian regimes like China's can attain Weberian legitimacy, that is, popular belief in the virtue of the political system and its authorities, by providing material economic benefits to its citizens, despite the lack of procedural accountability or popular participation in politics featured in democratic countries. So the Communist Party of China's own political legitimacy among its domestic citizenry has been tied to revenues generated by its exports in the global marketplace, with American consumer demand, of course, a major driver not only of China's domestic economic growth, but by implication, its political legitimacy at home. So what we have been seeing, though, in recent years, and perhaps even more than a decade, however, is a turn away from this externally oriented, export-driven notion of performance legitimacy to a more inward-focused economic development model, which might be traced to the trends depicted on this graph here of China's GDP since 2006, which has gone from a peak of 14.2% growth in 2007 to a low of around 2 or 3% growth in the past few years. And then this might be acceptable for some countries, but it is the relative drop in these numbers that is so highly problematic for China when political legitimacy is so intertwined with high economic growth. Now, many analysts studying these trends have found that this downturn might be traced to a shift in China's behavior following the financial crisis in 2008, with some researchers focusing on the insecurity that the global financial crisis and the dramatic decrease in demand for Chinese produced goods resulting from it might have generated among China's leadership. For example, Margaret Pearson at the University of Maryland, along with co-authors Meg Rithmeyer and Kelly Tsai, write in a 2022 International Security article that the financial crisis and its aftermath sparked an acute sense of insecurity, as this sudden drop in external demand highlighted China's dependence on exports. As Premier Wen Jiabao lamented regarding the Chinese economy in March 2010, quote, "There is insufficient internal impetus driving economic growth. Our independent innovation capability is not strong. We urgently need to transform the pattern of economic development onto the track of endogenous growth driven by innovation." And upon assuming office in 2012, Xi Jinping also cautioned that China's new normal required reorientation of its economic model, noting that lower growth should be expected, and to drive development, the country should reduce reliance on exports by emphasizing domestic consumption. So I think that this context of insecurity from the drop in demand from the financial crisis seems to make recent policy decisions by the Chinese party state less surprising. For example, when China continued with a very aggressive COVID containment policy, which became known as zero COVID, lasting almost to the beginning of 2023, I think many people were somewhat shocked to see the party continue with a policy direction so at odds with its externally oriented, growth-driven model, and by implication, also at odds with the assumed source of its political legitimacy. So now, just to briefly recap what became known as zero COVID, these are the policies enacted by China's leadership, and likely in a singular way by President Xi Jinping, whose goal was preventing any transmission of COVID-19 virus through 2021 and 2022, with the policies only ending at the very end in December 2022. And here, Zero COVID policies included full lockdowns of major megacities, including Shanghai, with significant negative economic consequences, which throughout 2022 were enacted despite the availability of COVID vaccines. According to the Wall Street Journal, the zero COVID containment measures came at a high cost, cutting sharply into the nation's exports and retail sales, draining local finances, and driving parts of the population to a near breaking point. Given that this might have been the starkest break by China's leadership away from one of the main sources of its domestic legitimacy over the past 3 decades, it was not surprising to see rare waves of protests in China's largest cities in late November 2022, as seen as this slide here, coupled with urgent pleas from many corners of the government, which seemed to finally prod Xi Jinping to end zero COVID in early December of 2022. So again, while the residential lockdowns that characterize zero COVID might have seemed surprising given China's focus on economic growth over the past few decades, they seem easier to understand if one views these policies in the context of a gradual but continuous turn away from the international economy in the aftermath of the financial crisis in 2008 to an economic system built more on domestic consumption and a reduced reliance on exports. As President Xi cautioned, upon taking office, lower growth should be expected, and zero COVID seems perhaps one of the clearest signs of that. So now some scholars go even further to suggest that an economic security dilemma has been a byproduct of China's turn away from an externally driven model of economic and political performance, leading to a focus much more on economic national security than on economic growth. David Bowman at Johns Hopkins has recently published an article about this, arguing in game theoretic terms that between 1994 and 2008, the US and China were involved in a mutually beneficial stag hunt coordination game, which devolved into an uncooperative prisoner's dilemma after the global financial crisis. So in the stag hunt period before 2009, Bowman argues that China and the US generally agreed that cooperating in the international liberal order would benefit both sides. In China, WTO accession led to direct benefits via increased internal demand for Chinese products, helping China achieve its fastest ever pace of sustained growth between 2001 and 2007. Bowman continues that although a popular current narrative in the United States contends that China always intended to take advantage of the WTO and resist meaningful domestic reforms, this is belied by the pace of disruptive reforms that followed WTO accession in China. Most notably, China's private sector share of industrial value added grew from 15% in 1998 to 63% in 2007. But after 2008 and 2009, the financial crisis upended the stag hunt payoff structure as economic insecurities in both countries grew, with insecurity-induced economic protectionism perceived by the other side as defections. So an economic security dilemma was the result, according to Bowman. Now, one of the reasons I call the dynamics of the triangle the new volatility is that there is more than just this camp here suggesting that China's recent foreign policy is motivated by economic insecurity. Another camp seems to have emerged focused less on insecurity and more on the belief that Western and specifically American global dominance is on the decline, leading to greater confidence in some aspects of China's foreign policy. So this declinist camp might have taken shape after the initial shock of the financial crisis wore off, and the period of economic insecurity in China may well have given way, perhaps at different times or among different segments of China's foreign policy elite, to a sense of Chinese optimism that the US economy was systemically vulnerable. And I feel it is important to mention declinism. And I feel that it is important to mention declinism because it seems to appear in all sorts of news articles on US-China relations. For example, in June 2023, as Secretary of State Blinken met with President Xi to ease tensions in the wake of Balloon Gate, as seen in this slide here on the left. As the New York Times covered it, the tensions were partly attributed to Xi Jinping's perception of the United States to be in quote unquote terminal decline. The notion of declinism has been bandied about so much that some authors, such as in a recent article from The Diplomat, have pushed back, finding that the widespread assumption of declinism in the media is dangerous and unfounded, and that declinism is far from pervasive among China's foreign policy elite. But what is declinism as a social science concept? Declinism refers to a hypothesized belief among segments of China's leadership, including President Xi Jinping, that American or Western economic and political decline, rather than continued superpower dominance, is imminent. This belief is often theorized to pair with a Chinese superiority or capitalist instability narrative in policymaking and intellectual circles, giving rise to the view that China's own domestic institutional and political system possesses significant advantages to Western democracy among China's elite. Now, some analysts of China's foreign policy circles, such as Jude Blanchett of Johns Hopkins, argue that the 2008 financial crisis appears to have precipitated a shift in ideas among China's foreign policy elite, evidenced by an explosion of Chinese language articles extolling the superiority of the Chinese system, as well as diagnosing the deterioration and atrophy of U.S. financial power and governance competency. This hypothesis is supposedly translated, says that this is supposedly translated into an increasingly confident China on the global stage. So this declinism thesis is a rather provocative claim. It's become quite widespread, though, which on top of that seems to contradict some of the economic insecurity thesis that has taken hold at the same time among other scholars. But hopefully this following example of China's response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine clarifies in some ways how China's foreign policy might be swinging back and forth in somewhat volatile ways between these two different perspectives. So for instance, a recent paper published by Guo Guangwu of Stanford University and the Asia Society, a paper on China's response to the Russian war in Ukraine, I think bears this out. I'm sure many of you know China's actions regarding Russia since the invasion of Ukraine have toyed with an undeclared alliance with Russia, especially in the first phase of the war from February 2022 until about a month after the invasion. This period was marked by China's declaration of a friendship without limits with Russia, which received a lot of media attention as analysts wondered whether it had been a tacit green light for Putin's special military operation. This no limits phase might be seen as the first phase in China's response to Ukraine, rooted, according to Wu, in President Xi Jinping's belief that the West is declining while the East is rising. However, Wu also finds that a second, more prolonged phase following the military stagnation of the Ukrainian invasion forced Xi to make some security recalculations and policy adjustments that seem much more consistent with economic insecurity. After Russia's stagnation in its Ukraine war later in the spring of 2022, China hedged its support for Russia, abstaining from voting on UN Security Council resolutions regarding the war, and instead Beijing reiterated its support for non-interference in the UN Charter's sovereignty principles. When Xi visited Moscow, he also did not meet Russia's twin goals of signing an agreement to build the Power of Siberia 2 gas pipeline or supply lethal weapons to Russia. And China's approach during this phase of the war became known as the two-hand strategy, aiming to placate the West while still supporting Russia. In this sense, Beijing has been careful not to violate Western sanctions against Russia for fear that it would trigger secondary sanctions on China, suggesting a desire on China's part to maintain or even repair its ties with the US. But then the third phase of China's approach to the Ukraine war seems to swing back towards the confidence of declinism. As beginning in the summer of 2023, China has emphasized a war of attrition to undermine the West in the long term, with Wu concluding that this overall back and forth policy arc of volatility applies not only to China's stance on the Russo-Ukrainian war, but also to the broader rationale for its international conduct. So I think that assessment is broadly consistent with what I'm trying to say here about the new period of volatility that it seems like we might be in. And I'll start wrapping things up here with a quote from former Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coates, who told the Senate in 2019 that China and Russia are more aligned than at any point since the mid-1950s, and warned that threats to U.S. national security from the renewed collaboration will expand and diversify in the years ahead. And I think this proved quite prescient given the subsequent invasion of Ukraine, among other things. But what I believe I might have added to that in this talk seems to be that recent trends suggest we are in a new period of uncertainty with no clear trajectory, which is defined by what I'll call for now the new volatility. And this stands in contrast to the old volatility, if you will. Even though there were always Cold War era tensions, the US and China had been in a stable alignment based on mutual economic and security interests since the Nixon-Mao visit in 1972. A stability held in place in many ways by the alignment between the strong performance of China's exports in the global economy and the domestic political legitimacy that this sustained economic growth gave to China's Communist Party. Research in the past few years suggests, however, that the global financial crisis disrupted this old trajectory, causing China to turn inward in a variety of examples discussed here, and to move into closer foreign policy alignment with Russia in a dramatic reconfiguration of the US-China-Russia triangle. So where might we go from here? Because this talk has been aimed mainly at providing some historical context for the present and surveying some of the recent research aimed at interpreting these new developments. I've been a bit general and broad at times, but you can see the contours of some of the debates emerging about when and how these concepts specifically apply to China's actions. To turn back to that Diplomat article I mentioned earlier, you're already seeing some pushback about some of these claims being overblown, such as the claims that China believes the US to be in terminal decline, which according to the Diplomat ignores other evidence that there's far from a uniform consensus in Beijing about US decline, and an awareness of the diversity of views in Beijing's policymaking circles might allow for a more accurate appraisal of China's approach to strategic competition. This in turn can help Washington craft smarter policy towards its principal strategic rival. And I think I'll stop there, and I look forward to any questions or feedback you have along those lines or about anything else I mentioned. Thank you.
Yeah, really great, Jonathan. Thank you so much. That's really interesting stuff. And I think the idea of analyzing this as a triangle is interesting too, because the legs of the triangle aren't always in some sort of forming some sort of alliance, right? There's tension in between the various nodes of that, or the corners of that triangle. And the Russia-China leg of that triangle to me is the most intriguing because it's the least well understood by foreign policy folks in this country for sure. Often it's assumed the relationship is closer than it seems because they seem like they would have more in common. So those who are looking at their interests might see that there's reason for Russia and China to actually be more together on things. But given the level of trust that has existed between Russia and China since the Chinese communists took over in '49, where do you think that level of trust is today? And is it different now based upon the essential flip in power status between those two powers, China and what used to be the Soviet Union and now Russia, since the Cold War? Where is that level of trust, and is there room for more than just lip service and diplomatic commentary?
Well, yeah, I think going back to the Coates quote, I think that Russia and China are closer than they've been since that earlier period in the 1950s. And so what I can say too is that it can kind of deviate in kind of very unpredictable ways. But yeah, the broad contours, what seems to be aligning is Russia and China being very close and trying to very much counter US hegemony. And yeah, I think that's where we are at this point in time. Now, like as different things happen, in Ukraine or elsewhere in the globe, I think China wants to always be hedging its bets and be able to return back to some sort of normal relations with the US in case Russia does something that is against Chinese interests. But yeah, I think that if we're just talking very schematically and very broadly, it's kind of China and Russia kind of very in close alignment at this stage of the triangle.
Great. No, that's good. I think that this you said hedging your bets, and that strikes me as a very typically Chinese behavior in a lot of ways. I'm gonna take a couple of questions from the in the Q&A block now popped in. I think they're very interesting questions, so I appreciate them. One of the audience members asks, how much influence, is any, does the organization affectionately known as BRICS, which China and Russia both founded and are current members of, contribute or shape in some fashion the US, China, Russia triangle? Are you familiar, or can you comment on that?
Yeah, I think that the BRICS, I guess Brazil, Russia, India, China, and I think South Africa sometimes is included in there. Is very much especially in terms of international institutions go. I'm not like an expert on, BRICS or really any of those major, those five major countries that are going out, except for China. But what I'm doing research on now essentially is how kind of especially Brazil, India helped China get up to speed in terms of its legal strategy at the WTO, in terms of contesting some of the moves that it believed were economic protectionism in the global economy. And Brazil, India, and China have all had major success in kind of basically WTO litigation, which has changed the calculus in a lot of ways about how international trade it kind of is used as a geopolitical tool, and in a lot of ways has kind of pushed back at, well, the BRICS countries, including China, have used parts of the liberal international order to advance their own interests. And so I think in that way, there can be a lot of collaboration between BRICS countries in terms of advancing these interests, especially economic interests of countries that are kind of, I guess you could refer to them as late industrializing countries. That being said, these countries are not always moving together as a bloc, and you can point to border tensions between China and India and various other kinds of tensions, but like all around China's border for evidence of that. So it's not a clear kind of BRICS strategy, but BRICS collaboration kind of moving together as a bloc. But in some areas, yes, and in other areas, no, and you kind of have to differentiate those.
Another question that came and asked essentially about energy, if you will, or issues that are outside of the triangle itself proper that shaped the triangle too. Question came from an audience member, says, haven't heard any mention of Taiwan. How does the competing interests of the US and China, considering reference to Taiwan, factor into this new period of increased uncertainty?
Well, yeah, I mean, so to start kind of the question, like there's a lot of other countries. Just look at kind of the discussion about all those Eastern Bloc countries that ended up dramatically. The Soviet response in the 1950s and 60s to reform movements in Eastern Europe ended up having a dramatic influence, which I'm arguing in the talk, on US-China, US-Russia, China-Russia relations. So yeah, all kinds of external actors can influence the dynamics of the triangle. And certainly kind of Taiwan, I don't necessarily know. I mean, there's so many issues going on. I mean, Taiwan just held elections that, changed some of the dynamics with regard to its relationship with the PRC. What I would say, I mean, I keep going back to what I'm seeing, though, is this new volatility. It's just this, I think that China has experienced at a macro level this kind of decline in economic growth. And it has led to probably factional divides within the foreign policy elite about what to do. Probably you could call the economic security camp kind of conservatives, and you could call maybe the declinist camp more of the kind of more expansionist like camp maybe of the China's foreign policy elite. And so I think what I tried to do there in that Ukraine example from the Wu article on Ukraine is well, I think a lot of people might have been thinking in the early no limits partnership as Russia invaded Ukraine, maybe China was assuming that that would go very well for Russia, and then they would follow pretty soon thereafter with an invasion of Taiwan or a peaceful reunification, whatever you want to call it. And that's not what happened. So, and now we're back into kind of this back and forth. Will they or won't they? What is going on? And I think that's where we're at. And I think from my perspective as an analyst or looking at this from the outside, really trying to understand it would be trying to understand any evidence that you can get of China's foreign policy elite and what are these, who are the important actors vying for kind of ideational power in the regime. And that will kind of help you understand maybe what they're going to do with regard to Taiwan.
Yeah, good. Excellent. Yeah, Taiwan will be a part of that tension in that leg, certainly, and will have a role to play between the U.S. and China and U.S. and Russia, as well as Russia and China. Good question from one of the audience members. A lot has been made in the last, well, certainly since 2016, and certainly, and as 2024 starts to unfold, a lot about the potential interference in election by, in this case, primarily actually Russia and China, although others are going to, I'm certainly going to try to meddle as well, but there's quite a lot of evidence already that there's significant meddling by Russia and China in the information space about U.S. elections. The question really is to what extent is the support of foreign far-right political parties and authoritarian leaders important to China and Russia? In other words, what role does the question implies that Russia and China actually see a favored outcome in the election in 2024. Is there one, or is there other? Do you see other intentions or agendas behind the sort of influence that is certainly being wielded?
Yeah, I'm definitely not an expert about this. My comments would kind of just be speculation, kind of reading the news. But from what I definitely think that you can go back and just look at a variety of like cyber espionage, cybersecurity kind of known, I think, attributions to China and Russia. It's just clear, absolutely, that both of those countries are attempting to meddle in foreign elections, including in the United States. Do I know that China or Russia has a favored president in the United States? I don't know. I think that if I'm remembering correctly, I think Trump said that he might end the Ukraine support for the Ukraine war if he's elected, and obviously Putin would like that. I mean, some of this stuff is very obvious. I don't think I have any additional knowledge there. Obviously, we know that President Trump was very much an architect of the trade war, and that seems to be much more anti-Chinese interest, but I don't necessarily know.
Yeah, that was another question I actually had, and I'll get back to the audience questions in a second. But given the shift in the development model in China from something that was basically export-based to something now that is much more consumer-based, attempting to transition fully to that, do you see China becoming increasingly or I guess decreasingly sensitive to sanctions, unilateral sanctions by the U.S.? Should they irritate the U.S. and the U.S. implement sanctions against them and not be able to get the rest of the globe to kind of go along with them? Do you see there a decrease in the sensitivity of Chinese leadership to U.S. unilateral sanctions? Reworded.
Well, and then sanctions, as again, some of my students in 507 might know, it's just kind of like, are sanctions effective? We kind of do that module and we're kind of like, we don't know for sure. we think that multilateralism helps. So if we have kind of a multilateral coalition that's interested in imposing and actually enforcing the sanctions, yes, potentially. I think that the question is a good one because, that the very macro, the decline in kind of the China attempting to limit its exposure, I suppose, to the international economy and kind of diversify would make you think potentially that it is less interested in sanctions. But then when we kind of go through and that whole kind of example of how the approach of China changed over time, there seemed to be some evidence that China was definitely, again, trying to hedge its bets and make sure that it was not in violation of any Russian sanctions, and because it didn't want any Chinese sanctions, any international sanctions imposed on China. So I think that there are, China is certainly definitely very aware of sanctions and not wanting to kind of be exposed to that kind of liability. But I think what they're trying to do is move away from that kind of exposure, but I don't think that they're there yet where they have that economic power to do that. So
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Great. One of the questions from the audience, and actually it's from one of your former students, I assume, as well as mine, ask, do you ever see the volatility of the triangle maybe expanding into a quadrilateral or a pentagon in terms of the shape? I mean, have you given any consideration to who might be a fourth or fifth actor in there that is meaningfully added in our analysis? Do we add Japan or India or the EU? Is there another way to shape that the geometry of the relationships that makes maybe shed some new light on the analysis?
Yeah, I think that there have been others who, may have published things before on kind of quadrilateral relationships and kind of added China to this triangle. But I think, in terms of, I mentioned that kind of at the outset, kind of usually what we talk about is unipolar, bipolar, and then they skip right over tripolar and do multipolarity. So then you kind of get into kind of more traditional IR theory where you're talking about a multipolar distribution of power. And I think that's where you would be if you kind of adding Japan, the EU, and all of this. But I think maybe I was reading maybe the Eikenberry-Mearsheimer debate. I think it was in Foreign Affairs about this whole containing China or integrating China into the international order back in kind of the 1990s. And I think at least from the U.S. perspective, it has been mostly about for the liberal side of it. Eikenberry was kind of talking about how a constant inclusion of a variety of alliance structures, such as that with Japan, South Korea, Australia, and even the EU, and that approach is also kind of central to the liberal approach, where like if you were kind of a liberal IR theorist and kind of advising the U.S. government, you would have the U.S. continue to foster and maintain those relationships, even though your principal strategic rival might be China or the Soviet Union or Russia. And that in that sense, what you're really getting into is not necessarily a quadrilateral kind of thing. It's going to be multipolarity. So, kind of in a liberal kind of conception of it, yeah, you're talking about principally China and Russia and the US in the triangle, but the US, for example, might be doing all kinds of different things to either balance or advance its interests using a variety of different international institutions or alliances to essentially maintain that tripolar strategy, but it's kind of involving a variety of different actors that way.
So you still see that as the kind of the central structure is the triangle, and the other structures, whether it's the EU or India or any of the BRICS or any of the other potential members of this geometry, are really still going to be secondary, ancillary to the primary structure, which is the triangle.
Right. And, I'm probably biased as kind of doing my PhD on China,
Yeah.
but yeah, it seems to, you know, where is the kind of nexus of power, and kind of a lot of China's scholars are trying to say is more about the tripolar relationship, but you can have debates over this all day long.
Sure,
But
sure. Yeah, well, and we only got another 15 minutes or so, so we'll move along here. Another question from the audience is, in your view, does China now see Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine and the West revulsion with it as a major liability in the China-Russian relationship? Where does that war stand in that leg of the triangle right now?
well, things are changing every day on the front lines there. But as far as I know, I'm kind of going off of that last article by Guo Guangwu, who's saying that now that kind of there's been this stalemate in the Donbass, and there hasn't been any major harm inflicted on Chinese interests by Russia's war. Uh, China has moved back kind of in alignment with Russia, and is kind of hoping for a war of attrition that undermines probably European and American dominance. That's what they're looking for. So I don't think at this point, I think there may have been a time during that kind of second phase of the war, where China might have been looking to move back to um, closer alignment with the West and with the United States. But then that's when you had, I think that might have been kind of about a year ago, and then where you had Balloon Gate and the floating spy balloons over the U.S. So um, there hasn't been, so all that in mind, I don't think there has been any real clean break between China and Russia with respect to Ukraine. It's still kind of fairly close, even though China is not kind of very settled in sort of any kind of real alliance on that issue.
So as long as they can downplay it, they'll downplay it because they kind of want to play both sides on that one, it seems, right?
Mhm.
Question from the audience, and I'm not familiar, and maybe you are. The question says that President Xi flew to San Francisco in November to meet with President Biden. Can you shed any light on what went on in that meeting? There seems to be very little known.
It, I don't quite know. I don't have any inside info on that, but what I do, I just know that or what I think I can remember is that the U.S. and China were, or the U.S. side was especially concerned with establishing a channel, that especially for military communications, to avoid any kinds of uh, unforeseen things that could spiral out of control. And yeah, I think the Blinken meeting that I mentioned there, kind of towards the end in June of 2023, was the kind of precursor to that meeting in San Francisco. And all of that, I get, the Balloon Gate was probably the nadir of U.S.-China relationships for not just in the past, recent history, but for a while. And which I don't know if people call it Balloon Gate or not, but that's what I was referring to, the shooting down of the spy balloon over U.S. soil. But I don't have any inside info, but it seems as though, at least for the moment, that military communications are back, and functioning properly again. At least, even though the tensions might be high, you need that to, at least make sure that there's no unintentional provocations. So I think that's where we are now. And then there were kind of some preliminary gestures at reinvigorating maybe some talks, or getting some people to people interactions, was kind of is what was actually started in the Nixon Mao thing. But now that in the contemporary context, kind of reinvigorating possibly some minor elements of U.S.-China cooperation in that San Francisco meeting. That's all that I kind of can remember, but not too much. I don't think it came out of the meeting other than that.
The media didn't seem that impressed, quite frankly. So, here's a question from a colleague of ours that I find pretty interesting. He says, I've read some analyses that there's a core tension in the Russia-China relations. One is that Putin wants to remake or tear down the international order, whereas China sees it as maintenance is centrally important to the welfare of its citizens. Are these analyses on the mark in your view? They have contradicting kind of intentions with regards to the international order. One to destroy or tear down, certainly displace the U.S., and the other one to maintain it as a function of maintaining the welfare of the domestic citizens.
Yeah, I think there might be. I mean, I don't know how to characterize it, but clearly it seems like Russia is much more focused on expansionism and kind of revisionism, both kind of historical and territorial revisionism, in, obviously in Eastern Europe. And as I did mention, kind of China's focus on sovereignty, at least in response to China wants to use, of course, Russia's any kind of military success that it has to Chinese benefit. So if it undermines U.S. interests, yes, they're in favor of it, but they're definitely against any violations of territorial integrity, any kind of, and you see this in the Ukraine invasion where I mentioned that in this, especially in that second phase, that China was very much interested in pointing out that it supports the UN sovereignty principles, and this kind of reflects some of that tension back in the Cold War when the Brezhnev Doctrine and Moscow said it could reserve the right to kind of make sure that any communist country is functioning the way that the Soviets want. So, yeah, I think that there is kind of in the background this tension between possibly an expansionist Russia and a China that is very interested in protecting its territorial integrity, assuming that it can get its kind of economy back in line and back onto a track that China thinks that its economy is being driven by kind of endogenous domestic consumer demand that is sustainable for China in the long term.
Mm-hmm.
And important to that, of course, would be maintaining its sovereignty and not being interfered with by other great powers, whether that's Russia or the United States in this triangle. So I think that comment or the question is I think on point, yeah, in a lot of ways. In contrasting Russian and Chinese approaches.
I'm going to combine two questions here from the question and answer block and see if I can make sense of them together. One question has to do with China's declining birth rate, which had expanded to China's declining population, because I think their population is actually just decreasing at this point, as a factor necessitating a new economic model. And maybe, as another member asked, as an expert on China, do you see any looming evolution away from the Communist Party? So kind of twofold. We have demographic issues, and we have declining negative trends, if you will, in demographics, and combined with any other issues that may be facing the Communist Party. Is there a movement away from that?
I think on the demographic issue, I think that in the sense that in a very broad sense, China's kind of productive capacity is declining, and its labor force is going to be in trouble. And that's kind of one of the reasons that at a very macro level, they're kind of trying to move much more towards driving their economy with consumer demand, because continuous reinvestment and manufacturing without that demographic influx of strong labor force moving forward is, there's talk of demographic cliffs, and you can go, and then you'll have a very difficult social welfare problem with the declining birth rate. So yeah, I think that constrains China in a lot of ways. Um, and that the demographic question is going to be important in a lot of ways. And I think I'm trying to remember what is the second part of the question about whether
Moving away from the communist, will there be any sort of social movement away from a communist party as a solution to some of the problems that they're going to be facing?
so I don't, you don't, um, it would just be speculation if I tried to weigh in on kind of the probability at this point. But you see a volatility. You have, major kind of China experts like David Shambaugh has kind of said that he sees a coming dissolution of the Chinese communist regime coming. That was in 2015. And at the same time, and that didn't happen, but at the same time, no one foresaw the end of the, Soviet Union. But that was clearly happening at the time, and we just weren't able to, pinpoint it. So I think that the place that I'd look, kind of going back to my talk, is the thing that is pretty interesting to me on a regime stability perspective for the Communist Party is the move away from this assumption of performance legitimacy, that they can kind of reorient their economy and get its domestic citizenry used to slower economic growth. They've got massive youth unemployment. They've got all these major problems that usually does not portend well and can lead to social movements, which is a big fear of the Communist Party. So those are the things that you would look at to see how is the Communist Party going to kind of create a new source of political legitimacy, or at least maybe have different pockets of legitimacy, if what the high-speed growth was their MO for years, and they're transitioning to something else that does lend itself to a little bit of political vulnerability, but we'd have to wait
Yeah,
and see.
that's an interesting question. And it's a question actually I was chatting with a colleague on earlier, is whether or not that shift in economic model from export dependent to something that was eventually consumer and endogenous to the economy itself, if that transition was ever successfully done by a single regime, because oftentimes
Right.
it results in some sort of regime change, which I think was where that question was headed, and is a really interesting one. We got 2 minutes left. I'm gonna give you one more question and then we'll wrap up. This question is one, and I thought it was interesting too, because you didn't mention anything near as I can recall in your talk about the Belt and Road Initiative and where that fits. And so this, a member of the audience would like you to comment on the China Belt Road policy. Where does this aggressive economic development by China in Africa and elsewhere fit into the PRC's economic security or declinist camps?
Yeah, I think it would have been in kind of the confidence of declinism. And sorry, I had a BRI section in there. It kind of came out. I thought it would be better to save some time for the Q&A, but it's, yeah, definitely interesting. And I think, yeah, it would be more of kind of, maybe if we are pointing at the financial crisis as kind of an inflection point about what the Chinese leadership thought about the international economy, I think it was around this time that the BRI started being kind of developed and started getting rolled out there. And in the next few years, it started off kind of with a bang, where you have kind of probably assuming like uh, confident declinists in the Chinese foreign policy camp, I assume, would have pushed this in an attempt to kind of displace the United States as kind of an economic player in a lot of different areas of the world, and have Chinese investment, Chinese kind of infrastructure projects throughout the world, linking everything together. Which in the past year or so, as you kind of continue to see lower levels of growth in the past few years, the BRI projects are starting to dry up, and you're starting to see a lack of coherence in the whole kind of expansionist BRI project. So I think that that is a reflection of possibly kind of economic insecurity and just poor economic performance also, and just not having the capacity to kind of project outward economically like the party would want to, um, kind of reining the BRI in. But yeah, I think that the Belt and Road Initiative as a project was kind of like something that kind of the confident elements of the Chinese foreign policy were trying to push to really rival and kind of displace the US as a major kind of global player in the, developing world. And it looks at this point now that it's kind of being reined in, and we'll see where it goes from there.
Yeah, you could see how it would support both of those agendas, and as the declining, or as the at this point, I think shrinking actually Chinese economy, or certainly slowing the Chinese economy, you can see where that would be a less bigger priority of those worried about economic security as part of their legitimacy. Jonathan, thank you so much for doing this and taking the time out. It was a really interesting talk, very engaging conversation. Thank you to the audience members who posed questions, really good questions. We got to a lot of really big ideas. I appreciate it very much. Join us tomorrow. Actually, another event tomorrow at 4 o'clock. We're gonna meet with the directors of the Future Security Initiative, Professors Peter Bergen and Daniel Rothenberg, to talk about security challenges of 2024. Thanks again for coming, and we'll hopefully see you in the near future. Thanks, Jonathan.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, everyone.
See you.